So the Peacocke Prize essay is run annually. So a bit of information about the Peacocke Prize. It's run annually in memory of our founder, who you won't be surprised to hear, is Arthur Peacocke. And each year we invite undergraduate and postgraduate research students and taught postgraduate students actually, as well as sixth form students to submit an essay on any area relating to science and religion that they choose. So there's no commitment or requirement for them to write on the conference theme. And this is something that used to be very, very popular, had a bit of decline in the last probably three, 4 years. We've started to see a real resurgence in terms of applicant numbers, and it's judged by a small subgroup of the committee and occasionally other external academics who get together and look at them in the whole, and the undergraduate and postgraduate applications are reviewed together. And it has been increasingly difficult to make a decision over who is going to be awarded the Peacocke Prize. And so what we are now doing is we now award a Peacocke Prize and some highly commended essays that we feel perhaps didn't quite reach the same standard, but did provide us some thought-provoking or touched on a particular issue that we thought was important. And so for those of you who are looking at your conference program and thinking, what on earth have these New Voices papers got to do with the theme of panentheism? Why are they not related? That is because they are some of our highly commended essays from the Peacocke Prize, along with some of the others that weren't highly commended, but we thought would be of interest to conference delegates. However, having said that, we are really, really pleased to introduce our Peacocke Prize winner for 2024. And that's Joseph Yue, who is studying a DPhil at the University of Oxford. Joseph is from Henan in China, and he's currently a DPhil candidate in theology and religion at the University of Oxford and a 2024 graduate scholar in science and religion at Oriel College. He's currently being supervised by Professor Mark Harris, who most of you here will know, and Dr. Sean Henson, and Reverend Dr. Andrew Pinsett. He wishes to examine the extent to which theological difficulties caused by the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics could be resolved by neo-Aristotelian metaphysics. His ultimate interest concerns the nature of neo-Aristotelian metaphysics and its ability or lack thereof to solve various contemporary problems in science and religion. So a real combining of the old and the new, which I think is really interesting. His student essay prize was awarded for an essay entitled A Hylomorphic Reading of Genesis 1, How Aristotle May Convince Young-Earth-Creationists of Evolution. So I'm sure there will be a lot of questions following this. We have roughly 45 minutes in total for this paper, and we'll be completed around 2:35. So I'm going to hand over to you, Joseph. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And first of all, I want to thank the Science and Religion Forum for awarding me this prize, and I was very surprised, to be honest, because this paper was originally a sort of side project, has almost nothing to do with my main line of research. So how it emerged was because I don't know whether any of you has Young-Earth-Creationist friends. I know it sounds weird, but bear with me. I do. And being a good Aristotelian, I know my conceptual distinctions. So I'm not friends with them insofar as they are Young-Earth-Creationists. Their Young-Earth-Creationism is an accidental feature to our friendship. Okay, just make that clear. But I mean, wouldn't it be nice? Wouldn't it be nice if we don't have to argue about evolution every day in our friendships? So that's how I came up with this paper, this idea. Well, hold on a minute. We've been arguing about Young-Earth-Creationism and evolution all day long. And the very first premise is that Young-Earth-Creationism is incompatible with evolution. But what if both can be true? And this is the theme of this paper. So let me just share my screen. So what if both are true? Now, this idea is not so much an answer to, like a definite answer to the problem, as an sort of exploration. It's an exploratory idea. And the idea is this. So, sorry, went through this part already. The idea is that it would be more charitable towards others, because I feel that part of the reason why it's so difficult to talk to Young-Earth-Creationists, in my experience of talking to my friends, is that people tend to just take YEC as absurd and mock them outright. And I think it would be more firstly charitable to, well, take them more seriously and give them a hearing and listen to their reasons if they have any. And then secondly, it would be also more effective in communicating the fruits of evolutionary science. And then thirdly, there might also be serendipitous discoveries along with this line of research. So this is idea. The structure is basically this. I don't think I need to introduce the conflict between creationism and evolution, so that everyone should be familiar with that. So I would just start from the failed justifications of Young-Earth-Creationism. Now, one of the greatest difficulties faced by Young-Earth-Creationism is the danger of falling into extreme fideism. Fideism holds that truths can only be attained through divine revelation and faith, independent of reason. Moderate fideism may have a place in regarding certain abstract theological propositions, but this view cannot be extended to concrete and tangible things. Otherwise, we would not know many common sense facts that we do obviously know. For example, potatoes exist. This is not divinely revealed, but we know potatoes exist. But this is exactly the conclusion that some of the Young-Earth-Creationists fall into. The evolutionists have been insisting from the beginning that evolution is the most rational explanation for the concrete biological and geological evidence available to us. If, however, one declines to argue and to engage with the evolutionists and chooses to believe in Young-Earth-Creationism in spite of reason, then extreme fideism follows. To avoid this disaster, there are generally two approaches on the part of the YEC theorists. First strategy is that of finding alternative natural mechanisms by which the evidence arose. And such endeavors are usually labeled as scientific by YEC theorists. And the epitome of this approach is the famous argument in Whitcomb and Morris' book, The Genesis Flood. I don't think I need to dwell too much on this. Everyone knows what this is about. And it's deeply unsatisfying, and it's very much misinterpretation of evidence. And as David de Pomeroy and Mark Harris noted in their paper in 2017, I quote, their endeavor have been shown to be entirely false by the mainstream empirical sciences countless times, end quote. The second strategy is to the second strategy of YEC to rationally reconcile themselves with the evidence for evolution is Omphalo's hypothesis. And this is at least more honest about the metaphysical nature of Young-Earth-Creationism. And Omphalo's is an 1857 book by Philip Goose, in which he hypothesizes that God created the world in its present form about 7,000 years ago, even though there's evidence which makes the world look as if it is old. So this is why it's called as-ifism, I suppose. So his idea is this, is that in order for the world to be functional, God must have created it with the necessary old-looking components in it, such as fossils, tree rings, and so on and so forth. But this is only a facade. And since God gave to living things the appearances of a history that, in fact, they have not experienced. And the problem for this is obviously, firstly, it entails that God is deceptive. And this has a disastrous theological implication, because if we could not trust in God even on the mundane things of nature, how could we trust him in his revelation for things unseen? And second, second objection to this is last Thursdayism, which is that, well, if you say the world was created 7,000 years ago, even though it appears much older, well, there's no reason to believe that the world wasn't created last Thursday with the appearance of being much older. So this strategy fails as well. Now, I want to propose an Aristotelian perspective from which a Young-Earth creationist may be able to conditionally accept evolution without having to give up the essentials of Young-Earth creationism. So, has several points. First of all, the essential tenet of Young-Earth-Creationism is the text of Genesis 1, which describes creation of the world in 6 consecutive days, should be understood literally. But what does it mean to say that? Well, the debates about what the word day means, right? Everyone knows about that. And the debates, less extensive debates about what the word creation or to create means. But as far as I'm aware, there hasn't been an Aristotelian approach on this. So the meaning of the key word to create, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, is to bring into being or to cause to exist. Aristotle has, however, comprehensively analyzed the different senses and modes of being or existence. Crucially, he thinks that being has 2 meanings. I quote, hence the same thing can both be and not be at the same time, but not in the same respect. From Metaphysics, Book Gamma. By being and not being in the same different respects, he specifically refers to the distinction between actuality and potentiality. The former denotes the state of complete reality or existence, purely and simply, while the latter indicates a lesser and incomplete state of being. And this is most eminently demonstrated in Metaphysics book Theta. And so here's a quotation, quotes, the world actuality which we connect with complete reality has, in the main, been extended from moments, from movements to other things. And in another place, he says, for of non-existent things, some exist potentially, but they do not exist because they do not exist in complete reality. Much more can be said about the distinction between actuality and potentiality, but for the present purpose, the most relevant part of this Aristotelian theory is captured by hylomorphism. According to hylomorphism, every material object, be it an organism or an inanimate thing, is a form-matter composite. The object's form is its whatness, essential whatness, namely that which makes the object what it essentially is. And its matter is the material substrate that concretely constitutes the object. And for this, you can, for more discussion on this, you can check out Physics, Book 2, and Metaphysics, Book Delta. Hylomorphism is simply the metaphysics of actuality, potentiality, applied specifically to the material world, in which the matter of an object corresponds to this object in potentiality and its form to the actualizing principle, such that the whole form-matter composite alone is an object in actuality. In other words, form and matter only have existence when they all, both together compose individual subsisting things, and they cannot exist independently. So for an Aristotelian, being is not all or nothing. It can be graded as complete or various degrees of potentiality, incomplete being. The former is actuality and the latter potentiality. If a being is in actuality, it has existence, while a being in potentiality is ontologically real but non-existent. Lower levels of reality are nevertheless not equivalent to purely conceptual or imaginary things, which have no ontological reality whatsoever. So creation as a formal fiat. So far, it seems that in the Aristotelian framework, the concept of creation can be re-examined. And this, I think, indeed can be, the concept of creation indeed can be re-examined in a new light. The implication of the Aristotelian gradation of being, then, is that there might nevertheless be incomplete beings before creation, namely the matter of to-be-created things. At the moment of creation, these incomplete beings were infused with corresponding forms by God, thus brought into existence proper. For example, birds were created on the 5th day of Genesis 1. But before the 5th day, there could have been formless chunks of matter corresponding to the material aspects of actual birds. These chunks of matter would have exactly the same materiality as actual birds, except that they possess no avianness, which makes them birds. In other words, before the 5th day of creation, meteorological nihilism was true about birds. There were no such things as birds, only chunks of matter arranged birdwise, as meteorological nihilists would say. On the 5th day, however, due to the infusion of the avian form, birds were brought into existence, and meteorological nihilism ceased being true about birds. So one may imagine a similar process going on through each day in Genesis 1. As God spoke, various kinds of material chunks in a predetermined order were liberated from the shadow of their incompleteness and raised to a more dignified ontological state, namely existence. This picture is also consistent with the traditional Christian understanding of God as pure actuality, who generously imparts the gift of participation in actuality, that is himself, to creatures. At this point, the Young-Earth-Creationists may object that this model contradicts the traditional Christian doctrine of creation ex nihilo, That is, God created everything from nothing, rather than from incomplete being. Worse, their critique seems to find support in Thomas Aquinas, on whose metaphysics this model is also largely based. In De Potentia Dei, for example, Aquinas explicitly says that we must hold firmly that God can and does make things from nothing. But is that the whole picture? I argue not, because the word creation here is ambiguous. It may refer to the entire event described in Genesis 1 as one single act, the big C creation, capital C creation. Or the word creation may mean the generation of a specific part of the world, small c creation, such as the quote-unquote creation of birds on the fifth day. According to Aquinas, though, the doctrine creation ex nihilo does not apply to the latter sense, to the small c creation. As he writes, I quote, the divine scriptures assert that at one time the earth was void and empty. They imply that matter was formless. De Potentia Dei, question 4, article 1. In other words, what was created ex nihilo in the beginning was only formless matter. The subsequent quote-unquote days saw the creation of individual things ex materia. Hence, Aquinas says, quote, formless matter preceded the formation of things, in the same article. Nevertheless, the stages of creation, big C creation, taken all together as one single event, is still ex nihilo, because there was indeed nothing at all before the first moment of the big C creation. So the hylomorphic view of Genesis 1 is consistent with the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. Now one may ask, where exactly does evolution fit into this model? I argue that it fits precisely in the material aspect of creation. Since science in general buys to methodological naturalism, it does not, or at least should not, concern metaphysical questions. One may easily fall into the misapprehension that evolutionary biology studies species of animals, but the fact is it merely describes changes to the inherited traits of organisms across generations. In other words, evolutionary biology studies particular outward manifestations and appearances of organisms, but not organisms per se, or organisms essentially. Questions such as what is essentially a cat and which feline traits are intrinsic would be irrelevant to the purpose of evolutionary science. So understood in this way, it's possible that evolution and Genesis 1 describe two different aspects of reality, such that both can be held literally true. Both can be held literally true, but in different senses. Consider the bird example again. Bird example again. According to evolution, birds in their material aspect evolved for the matter of previous reptile species and share a common ancestor with lizards. This does not, however, necessarily negate Genesis 1, which claims that birds were created before there were any terrestrial animals. For it could be the case that chunks of matter arranged bird-wise did come about through evolution, but on the fifth day of creation, the divine fiat gave them proper existence, while the mass of other land reptiles received their respective forms only on the next day. Another objection from the YEC theorists may be that the time scale of evolution and that of Genesis 1 do not correspond. Because according to evolution, or really, well, science, there were billions of years before the creation of birds. But there were only 4 days before the 5th, according to Genesis 1. How could such an egregious discrepancy be explained? The solution, I think, hides in the gap between the very first moments of creation and the formation of light. Because the word day, be it 24 hours or not, was defined in Genesis 1 in terms of light and darkness. As Genesis 1:5 says, quote, "And he called the light day and the darkness night, and there was evening and morning one day." Light itself, however, was only created in Genesis 1:3, rather than at the very beginning, at verse 1. So how then could there be days in the first 2 verses? The most sensible explanation seems to be that there was a period of time spanning the history of the universe from Big Bang to Genesis 1:3, when light was actualized. But the universe contained only potentiality, various chunks of matter during this immense gap of time until they were actualized over the course of 6 days, around 7,000 years ago. So far, I've presented this model, but it remains a possibility, no matter how coherent this model is. So why would Young-Earth Creationists pay any heed to this model? Well, I'm going to present 3 reasons, 3 merits of the hylomorphic understanding of creation. First, the hylomorphic model avoids the deceptive God objection. In the Omphalos hypothesis, God is supposed to have implanted things with very old appearance everywhere, even though the world is actually young. Therefore, the creator may be accused of deception. But in the hylomorphic exegesis, God is not deceptive, nor is our cognition skewed, because birds really did evolve materially from matter of earlier reptile species. Whereas the birds really were created also formally by God on the 5th day of creation, according to the biblical text. The hylomorphic reading of Genesis 1 also gives God the most credit, for he speaks simply and marvelously through both the book of scripture and book of nature, the harmony between which was a constant theme among pre-modern Christian theologians. The Young-Earth-Creationists at this point may complain that this model renders creation null and insignificant, since the infusion of forms does not make any empirical difference. But this complaint comes from a presumed nominalism, consciously or not. By doing so, they deny the ontological significance of forms and essences, which have been an inseparable part of Orthodox Christian theology from the early church. Besides, nominalism is a metaphysical position which must be argued for rather than simply stated. Second merit is that the hylomorphic exegesis mitigates the last Thursday objection. This objection argues that if the world could have been created 7,000 years ago with a facade of being much older, then it's also possible for the world to be created last Thursday with a much older facade. It seems that this objection applies with equal force to the hylomorphic model. After all, why could the actualization of species not have happened last Thursday with only chunks of matter preceding it? But this could not have been the case in hylomorphism. To understand this, one must first appreciate the Aristotelian rejection of the mind-body problem. For in the Anima, Book 2, Aristotle says, quote, "That is why we can wholly dismiss as unnecessary the question whether the soul and the body are one. It is as meaningless as to ask whether the wax and the shape given to it by the stamp are one. end quote. The wax devoid of the shape given by a stamp would still be wax, but a different kind of wax, without the signification carried by the stamp's shape. Similarly, the function proper to each organism are rooted not in the matter, but in the form of the organism, what Aristotle calls soul. Without forms, the various chunks of matter would not have had the unique biological functions pertaining to the specific organisms, but only the equivalent in potentiality. And specifically, there is an empirically traceable function special to human beings. Maybe not to other animals, I don't know, but there is one to human beings, namely rational intellect, from which imagination and creativity flow. A chunk of matter corresponding to a human being would have most basic behaviors, indistinguishable from that of actual human being. But the lack of cognitive structure grounded in human form means that such matter is unable to create, and thus there would not be traces of civilization until the actualization of human beings. But we know that there have been human civilization since at least 5,000 years ago. This fact supplies the hylomorphic exegesis. This fact supplies the hylomorphic exegesis a cap of a latest possible time, only before which could creation have happened. Otherwise, evidence of civilization would have appeared only from that Thursday. Nevertheless, this strategy cannot add a cap in the other direction, which means the hylomorphic model does not indicate the earliest possible time of creation. Human beings could have been actualized 50,000 years ago. We don't know. Maybe the evidence of civilization from 50,000 years ago simply did not survive. Therefore, the hylomorphic exegesis only mitigates, but not fully eliminates the last Thursday objection. The third merit is that it dissolves the problem of animal suffering. One of the main worries of Young-Earth-Creationists is that there's immense suffering for animals during the evolutionary history, and this makes God seem cruel. But this should not be a worry under hylomorphic reading of Genesis 1. As form is the principle of unity, without which there cannot be a unified individual subject. So the chunks of matter before creation were not unified individual subjects. Mereological nihilism being true, the boundary between a tree, for example, and the caterpillar was not a one of kind, but rather an arbitrary assignment based on presumably molecular distance, or so on and so forth. In fact, there were neither trees nor caterpillars at all in the potentiality before creation, before their specific creation, that is, small c. Only individual animals, however, can possess cognitive functions, which are prerequisites of suffering. Therefore, they could not have been suffering before creation. The chunks of matter simply did not have the metaphysical aptitude to be able to suffer. Animal suffering, therefore, is not a valid objection to the hylomorphic exegesis from Young-Earth-Creationists. To summarize, to this day, many people still subscribe to Young-Earth-Creationism and take it as a reason to reject evolution. Diverse efforts to convert them have largely fallen flat, at least partly due to the contempt often hold towards Young-Earth-Creationists. Hence, it would be more charitable and probably more effective if there is a model that communicates the fruits of evolutionary science without challenging the core beliefs of Young-Earth-Creationism. This paper offers precisely such a model, based on Aristotelian metaphysics, especially the theory of hylomorphism. Hylomorphists maintain that every material object is composed of a form and its matter, neither of which exists independently. In the hylomorphic reading of Genesis 1, evolution and Genesis 1 describe two different aspects of reality, such that both can be held literally true in different senses. The Genesis text is true in the formal sense, even though evolution is also literally true in the material sense. Thus, the Earth is formally literally 7,000 years old, yet its materiality can be traced back through evolutionary history. From a hylomorphic perspective, therefore, Young-Earth-Creationists can conditionally accept evolution without compromising their core convictions. Further, this paper argues that Young-Earth-Creationists should accept the hylomorphic model, given its manifold more merits, comparing to various other Young-Earth-Creationist theories, which leave no room for evolution. On the other hand, through this model, scientists may also appreciate the narrative of Genesis 1 as rationally warranted, without having to believe in it themselves. There's some remaining problems with this model, though. The greatest puzzle, I think, is the ontological status of the chunks of matter before creation. In what sense does this chunk of matter correspond to the matter of a donkey, while that chunk of matter corresponds to the matter of the cat? Because, well, when there was only potentiality, presumably there was no form at all, right? So what makes this chunk of matter correspondence to the matter of donkey and that chunk of matter to the matter of cat? Well, we don't know. One wild guess of mine is that the quantum state of this chunk is identical to the quantum state of a donkey, and so on, taking Bohr interpretation into account. But it would probably take a doctorate to smooth out the metaphysical details in this. And another worry is the metaphysical anachronism imposed on the text of Genesis 1. Reading it into it, what the original author did not intend. But sophisticated exegesis rarely abides to what original biblical authors intend alone, which is obviously even in the exegesis of St. Paul in his New Testament letters. Besides, Young-Earth-Creationists imposing nominalism is much more, I would argue, anachronistic than the hylomorphic model. So the main points of the paper still stands. So finally, I want to invite reflections on the implication of this model for theology and for science and religion specifically. Thank you very much. I would like to thank my friends, my Young-Earth-Creationist friends, Samuel Ho and Jacob Campert, for inspiring this conversation, without whose vehement opposition this paper would never have seen the sun, basically. Yeah, I would also like to thank Father Andrew Pinsent for his constructive criticism. Yeah, thank you everyone very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Joseph. And I think I just want to pick up on a sort of a comment that's coming in the chat about whether you were making the same mistake as the Young-Earth Creationist in your taking the text too literally. And that one of the reasons that this paper won is because we really enjoyed the fact that you were saying, I'm not challenging your starting position, right? Which is that how could we bring these two things together, and how can perhaps I convince you of the merits of evolution in and of itself without challenging you of the young Earth, like your wider beliefs that the Earth is young. So I think that was one of the things that we really liked, in that you were doing something quite narrow, but also trying to respect both those views. So that was really appreciated. We've got 5 minutes. We've already got a couple of questions in the chat, and I was trying to work out if I could turn them into a single question. I'm not sure I can, but what I'll do is I'll give them to you both together, because I think there's probably a theme. And then if we've got time, we can come to other questions from Luca and Marius. So the first question from John is the engineer's drawing the form and the engineered object the material object? Would that be an appropriate distinction or analogy to make? And then the second question is that Andrew's put, a scientist might object that although they're not invested in identifying essences, they are involved in describing forms, i.e. the information content of all things and not just the material substratum. In other words, scientists can also claim hylomorphism in their description of evolution. So I will leave you with those two first, then we'll see if we've got a chance to come to Luca and Marius.
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand the first one. The engineers drawing the form.
I'll read it again. It says, is the engineers drawing the form, then we have the engineered object, which is the material object. John, I don't know if you want to come in if you've got Mike.
Right. Sorry, can you
that's
say
all I've got, sorry.
Yeah. No, I don't think
John, hang on, John's in.
I mean, the drawing is the concept. It has a reality, doesn't it? And then it becomes material once the form is made, once the form is put into material being, as it were.
Yeah.
So there's an analogy there, I think. That's how I see it here. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, John. So
I see. Engineer's drawing. Oh, yeah, like blueprints. Yeah, well, that would be the obvious analogy, but still it stays an analogy because what the form is actualizing principle of the material object. So it does much more than the engineer's drawing. Yeah, so I think fundamentally one can use that analogy to help understand this concept, but it has its limitations. Yeah. And the second question, sorry, I'll answer the comments that you made at the beginning. So am I taking am I making the same mistake of taking the text too literally? Well, firstly, do I believe in this model myself? I'm open to persuasion. So as I said, there are some problems, pretty big ones, in fact, and that haven't been solved. You know, at the beginning, I said this is a very wild idea that just popped into my head, and I'm trying to explore what's in it. And secondly, I mean the Young-Earth-Creationists do take the biblical text too literally. But I mean, the problem with that is precisely to the exclusion of you know, the scientific evidence. And there could be, I think, a perhaps less literal reading of Genesis 1 and still make essentially the same point. I hinted at that during my presentation. So for example, you don't have to take 6 days literally, but essentially will still be the same model. You can take day to mean, I don't know, like Augustine said, different stages, right? Or you can take other things less literally, but it will still be the same model. And ultimately, I want to put this model out, and then maybe there could be rooms for twisting around and still make it a fruitful ground of exploration. Yeah.
Thanks,
So
Joseph. I think we're going to have to stop actually, but what I'd suggest is just so we've got time to hand over to Taylor. But I think if you've got questions for Joseph, do get in touch. We're always happy to pass your questions on. I think what I would do is I'll pass questions on that we've got to Joseph via email after this. If you would like me to share your email with Joseph so he can reply to you, you can kind of get yourselves involved in a conversation, please just drop me an email to the forum email address, and we can carry on that way. There are also additional networking opportunities and social opportunities during this conference, so do reach out if you happen to be in the same space as well. But I just want to really thank Joseph. I thought it was a really thought-provoking paper, and we're hoping to be able to welcome Joseph to the anniversary conference in Sheffield as well next year. So there'll be a chance to actually corner him over coffee and have a chat about this. So thank you ever so much for your questions in the chat. We will share those with you, Joseph. And thank you everyone else for listening. Really appreciate it.